The COVID-19 pandemic, said to be the defining global health crisis of our time, has been the greatest challenge humanity has faced since World War II. It did not only create a severe health crisis, but a social and economic catastrophe. And after 3 years, its repercussions are still being felt across the world. This therefore drives the need to study disasters to mitigate its impact on lives and livelihood, to improve response and build resilience. Good day, I am Dr. Penny Adversario, and we are here to learn about the basic concepts in disasters, its terminology, types, classification, groups affected, and impact, to know the global and local disaster risk profile, to be aware of the most common disasters in our country, discuss the application of epidemiologic principles in disaster management, and the global and local policies for disaster risk reduction. So we start with definitions. What is disaster? The United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction defines it as a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or society which involve widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses and impacts that exceed the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. Likewise, in the definitions of the WHO and USAID, common terms stand out, like disruption, suffering, and exceeding capacity. The 2009 UNISDR terminology on disaster reduction aims to promote common understanding and common usage of disaster risk reduction concepts to assist the disaster risk reduction efforts of authorities and the public. The combination of exposure to a hazard, the presence of conditions of vulnerability, and the insufficient capacity or measures to reduce or cope with the potential consequences results to a disaster. The calculation of risk takes into account these three dimensions of hazards and exposure, vulnerability, and lack of coping capacity. The first dimension, hazards and exposure, measures the natural and human hazards that pose the risk. In simple terms, typhoon being the hazard exposes people and property to loss of lives and livelihood, which is the risk. The second and third dimensions cover population factors that can mitigate against or exacerbate the risk. The vulnerability dimension considers the strength of individuals and households relative to a crisis, while the coping capacity dimension considers factors of institutional strength. Risk assessment is a method to determine the nature and extent of risk by analyzing hazards and evaluating existing conditions of vulnerability. Disaster management is how we deal with the human, material, economic, or environmental impacts of disasters. It is the process of how we prepare for, respond to, and learn from the effects of major failures. The areas of disaster risk management include mitigation and prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery. Mitigation involves lessening of impacts of disasters, while prevention entails avoidance of its impacts. Preparedness is the knowledge and capacities developed by governments and institutions. Response is the provision of emergency services and assistance, and recovery is the restoration and rehabilitation of facilities and livelihood. Mitigation, prevention, and preparedness constitute pre-disaster activities, while response and recovery are post-disaster activities. A standardized international classification of disasters by the Center for Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters and Munich Reinsurance Company was developed in 2007. This was to establish and agree on a common hierarchy and terminology for all global and regional databases on natural disasters for comparison and exchange of data. It classifies disasters into two main types, natural and technological. Under natural, we have geophysical, which are events originating from solid earth, such as your earthquakes, volcanic activity, and dry mass movement. Second is meteorological, which are events caused by short-lived, small to mesoscale atmospheric processes, occurring from minutes to days, such as storms. Hydrological, which are events caused by deviations in the normal water cycle and/or overflow of bodies of water caused by wind, such as your floods and your west mass movement. Climatological are events caused by long-lived or meso to macro-scale processes, such as extreme temperature, drought, and wildfires. Biological are events caused by exposure to pathogenic microorganisms, toxins, and bacteria, under which would fall epidemics, insect infestation, and animal stampede. And extraterrestrial events are those caused by asteroids, meteoroids, and comets as they pass near the Earth or enter the Earth's atmosphere. A technological disaster is a catastrophic event that is caused by either human error in controlling technology or a malfunction of a technology system. Technological disasters can be further subdivided into industrial, under which would fall chemical spill, collapse, explosion, fire, gas leak, poisoning, radiation. Transport, under which would fall air, rail, road, and water. And miscellaneous accidents like fire, collapse, explosion, and others like stampedes and complex events such as armed conflict. This is an example of how disasters are classified following a hierarchy based on a triggering hazard or event logic. The triggering hazard or event is used as the reference root to classify the disaster. For example, a mass movement can be triggered by either a geophysical or hydrological phenomenon. The triggering hazard will then determine if the disaster is assigned to enter into the mass movement dry or mass movement wet category. Population groups most affected during disasters are the following. When Mayon volcano erupted in January 2018, many pregnant and lactating women were expected to stay in evacuation centers until they can return to their homes. Aside from hygiene needs, these women required prenatal and postpartum health care as well as specific nutrition. In children, the combination of poverty and disasters creates double vulnerability. The elderly feel more easily overwhelmed by a disaster. If they are cognitively impaired, they might have trouble understanding information or following directions. They might also have difficulty moving around, standing in line, or sleeping in noisy shelters. Sick individuals, especially those with chronic illnesses, have access and functional problems that render them vulnerable to disasters. It also affects persons with disability due to mobility limitations, hearing, or visual impairments. And among the disadvantaged, efforts to cope with these stressors result in deeper levels of economic debt and instability. As to the effects and impacts of disasters, we have the 3 Ds of death, disability, and disease. Most commonly, communicable diseases such as pneumonia and gastroenteritis. Injuries such as fractures, burns, lacerations, and crush injuries. Displaced persons. During the Marawi siege, an estimated 95% of the city's total population, over 354,000 individuals, were forced to stay with relatives outside of the city or relocate to various evacuation centers, which were crowded and lacked sufficient access to services, including latrine maintenance and hygiene supplies. Disasters also result to damage to property and destruction of assets, shortage of food, drugs, and medicine supplies, loss of services, socioeconomic disruption, environmental degradation, and the negative effects on mental and social well-being. The Emergency Events Database, or EMDAT, being maintained by the Center for Research on Epidemiology of Disasters since 1988, has for its primary objective the provision of information to support humanitarian action at the national and international level, enabling rational decision-making on disaster preparedness. The database offers objective evidence-based information that can be used to assess the vulnerability of communities to disaster, thus assisting policymakers in setting priorities. There are two time periods in this figure written on the left side, 2002 to 2021 and 2022. The type of disaster is seen above the figures, and this figure represents the average number of occurrence of disaster by type. In both time periods, 2002 to 2021 and 2022, the top three most frequently occurring disasters were flood, followed by storm, and then earthquakes. The average number of disaster occurrence was lesser from 2002 to 2021 compared to 2022 alone, which was 387. The three indicators of impact of disasters considered were death, number affected, and economic losses. By average number of deaths for the period 2002 to 2021, the highest was caused by earthquakes, followed by storm, then extreme temperature. In 2022, this extreme temperature now caused a higher number of deaths, followed by flood, then drought. It can also be seen from the figure that the Philippines ranked 8th in terms of mortality from disasters, which was attributed chiefly to the tropical storm Meggy. Consistently for both time periods 2002 to 2021 and 2022, millions were affected primarily by drought, followed by flood, then storm. Our country ranks 10th in terms of the number affected by disasters. Greater amount in economic losses was incurred in 2020 alone compared to the period 2002 to 2021. For both time points, storms followed by flood ranked highest in terms of billions of US dollars in economic losses. Third in rank was earthquake for the earlier period, while drought for 2022. In summary, there were more disasters and economic losses in 2020 than deaths and numbers affected for the period 2002 to 2021. This could be a reflection of climate change as well as improvement in disaster risk reduction strategies. The 2022 to 2023 Global Risk Perception Survey drew responses from 1,200 experts from the academe, business, government, international community, and civil society to identify 35 global risks. Global risk is defined as the possibility of occurrence of an event or condition which, if it occurs, would negatively impact a significant proportion of global GDP, population, or natural resources. Over 12,000 business leaders in 121 economies were asked to identify the top 5 risks from this list that pose the biggest threat to their country in the next 2 years. These were incorporated into the World Economic Forum's 2002 Executive Opinion Survey. Risk 1 indicates the most frequently selected risk in each economy. For the Philippines, natural disasters and extreme weather events tops the list. The Index for Risk Management Global Risk Index measures the risk of humanitarian crises and disasters in 191 countries. The Informed GRI model is based on risk concepts published in scientific literature with 3 dimensions of risk: hazards and exposure, vulnerability, and lack of coping capacity. Inform gives each country a risk score of 1 to 10, 1 being the lowest and 10 the highest, for each of the dimensions and overall risk score. The higher the score, the more at risk a country is to disasters. In the 2022 Inform Global Risk Index, the Philippines has an overall risk of 5.3 over 10, which Inform categorizes as high risk. The hazards and exposure dimension score takes into account a combination of both natural and human hazards, and the Philippines was rated 7.8 over 10. The vulnerability dimension score was 4.4 over 10, and the lack of coping capacity dimension score was 4.3 over 10. In addition, there is the Global Climate Risk Index 2021 for the period 2000 to 2019, which is based on average values over a 20-year period. It indicates a level of exposure and vulnerability to extreme weather events such as storms, floods, and a heat wave. The Philippines ranks fourth as the most affected by the impacts of extreme weather events. 6 of the 10 countries most affected belong to the category low to lower middle income. These countries, especially the most vulnerable parts of the population, are particularly affected by the damaging effects of a hazard and have a lower coping capacity. The Philippines has an increased vulnerability to natural hazards, which is attributed to the nation's geographic position in Southeast Asia. The country is part of the Pacific Ring of Fire, where 75% of the world's active volcanoes are located, and 90% of the world's earthquakes occur along it. In addition, the Philippines straddles along the typhoon belt in the western Pacific Ocean, where nearly one-third of the world's tropical cyclones form. It suffers from 20 to 30 typhoons every year, and it has the warmest ocean temperatures in the world, conducive for a typhoon to form. Second, being a nation of low-lying islands, its coastal regions are most susceptible to natural disasters, from typhoons to tsunamis. It ranks fifth in the world for its vast length of coastline. Third, with 60% of its population living in coastal zones, they are vulnerable to storm surges where the largest casualties are found. Fourth, over 25% of the nation's population lives below poverty line. In the poorest regions, houses are largely constructed from makeshift materials that are fragile, and there is little to no evacuation or risk mitigation planning. In summary, the Philippines experiences 20 earthquakes per day, 20 to 30 typhoons a year, has 22 active volcanoes and 36.2 kilometers of coastline, with 25% of the population living below poverty line, all the elements that could spell a disaster. This translates to 85 to 422 billion pesos cost of disasters to the Philippine economy per year and affecting 12.1 million Filipinos. Let us now go into examples of local, natural, and technological hazards. The 2013 Bohol earthquake, which registered a magnitude of 7.2 on the Richter scale, was the most destructive to hit the country since 1990. Destructive because damage to public buildings, roads, and bridges was worth 2.25 billion. More than 3.2 million people were affected, and more than 348,000 people were displaced. The latest to hit the country was the 7 magnitude quake in North Abra. The 1991 Mount Pinatubo eruption was by far the largest and the most destructive volcanic eruption in the country, which affected 364 communities and destroyed more than 8,000 houses, totaling to more than 10.6 billion pesos in losses. The latest volcanic eruption was the January 2020 to March 2022 Taal volcanic eruptions and the August 2022 Mayon volcano eruption. Typhoon Yolanda, international codename Haiyan, remains as the deadliest and the costliest typhoons in the country by far as of 2022. On October 2009, Typhoon Ondoy dumped 455 millimeters of rainfall in 24 hours, which is the average amount of rainfall Metro Manila receives in a month. The latest flooding was due to Typhoon Ulysses last November 2020. The worst landslide in Philippine history was triggered by a minor earthquake, magnitude 2.6 on the Richter scale, and exacerbated by a 10-day period of heavy rainfall. It buried the whole town of St. Bernard in southern Leyte. Of the 1,800 residents of Ginsaigugon, only 53 survivors were counted. In November of 1991, 3 hours of massive rain and 15-minute flash flood spawned by Typhoon Uring triggered landslides on the mountain range of Ormoc, Leyte, and washed away huge logs, properties, and lives. The most recent wildfire tragedy in Maui, Hawaii, was speculated to be a product of global warming combined with drought and a hurricane offshore generating high winds. Two of our latest local wildfires have been documented in the Mountain Province, one in Benguet and the other in Bontoc. Rappler source cite cattle rustling, slash and burn or kaingin technique, and negligence as the cause of the fires, aggravated by dry weather and wind from the northeast monsoon. With technological hazards, we have the following. On August 2006, an oil tanker sank off the coast of Guimaras in Negros Occidental, causing some 500,000 liters of oil to pour into Panay Gulf. The Guimaras oil spill damaged Tacloban Island National Marine Reserve, which is a marine sanctuary. It also posed a threat to the blue crab industry in the municipality. Because the waters were contaminated, fishing was prohibited, affecting the only livelihood of 20,000 fisher folks. Tourism was temporarily banned while cleanup drive was ongoing. On October 2007, 11 people died and at least 126 were injured after an explosion inside the Glorieta shopping complex at Ayala Center in Makati City. This was due to accumulation of methane gas in the building's septic tanks and other combustible materials in its basement, although the possibility of a terrorist attack was also considered. On April 2000, Air Philippines Flight 541 flying from Naiya to Francisco Bangoy International Airport in Davao City crashed in Samar, Davao del Norte while on final approach, killing all 124 passengers and 7 crew members. According to Time magazine, the MV Doña Paz tragedy was the worst peacetime disaster of the 20th century. On December 20, 1987, MV Doña Paz left from Tacloban City, Leyte for the city of Manila. The passenger vessel collided with a motor tanker between the provinces of Marinduque and Oriental Mindoro, leaving 4,341 dead and only 25 survivors. The Ozone Disco Fire happened March 1996, where 162 people, mostly students celebrating the end of the academic term, died in a nightclub fire in Quezon City. The management failed to provide fire exits and sprinkles inside the establishment, the fire extinguishers were defective, and that the lone exit was through a small door that swung inward and did not meet the standards set by the building code. In the Payatas landslide, 218 people died and 300 were reported missing when a large volume of garbage stored at the Payatas dam site in Quezon City first collapsed into nearby settlements, then went up in flames, destroying 100 shanties. The major reason for the landslide was the low waste density, which reduced the surface flow of rainfall water and resulted in a high rate of water infiltration into the waste. This triggered the collapse of the garbage pile. The incident prompted the passage of the Ecologic Solid Waste Management Act of 2000, which mandates the closure of open dump sites in the Philippines by 2004 and controlled dump sites by 2006. In the Philippine sports arena stampede, 78 people died in a crash at the venue of the first anniversary celebration of a popular Philippine television game show, as they scrambled to get into the show's offering of cash and other prizes. Complex emergencies are a combination of both natural and man-made causes which involve a breakdown of authority, looting, and attacks on strategic installations, including conflict situations and war. Such was the 5-month-long Marawi siege by the Mauti group of ISIS, which led to the death of more than 1,000 people and displacement of residents. Let us now go into a discussion of disaster epidemiology. CDC defines it as the use of epidemiology to assess short and long-term adverse health effects of disasters and to predict consequences of future disasters. It aims to prevent or reduce the number of deaths, illnesses, and injuries caused by disasters, provide timely and accurate health information, and improve prevention and mitigation strategies for future disasters. These are some of the applications of epidemiology in disasters: in identification of risk factors and preventive measures, identifying complications from crash injuries, informing strategies for preventing drowning in floods and hurricanes, evaluating effectiveness of intervention strategies. This is the disaster management cycle, the pre-disaster period occurring between disaster events, that is before the next disaster, entails work to prevent or mitigate the impact of future disasters. Example of prevention activities include physical infrastructure activities, policy efforts such as establishing and informing disaster-resistant building codes. It also involves preparedness activities like arranging volunteer deployment, training volunteers for search and rescue, and organizing systems for distribution of supplies. The disaster period occurs when disaster strikes. During this time, responders may conduct search and rescue, evacuate people, deliver emergency care, or provide shelter and food. Response, recovery, and rehabilitation take place in the post-disaster period when a return to pre-disaster conditions or normalcy is underway. Key disaster activities employing epidemiologic methods include rapid needs assessment, health surveillance, tracking systems, epidemiologic investigations and studies, and registries. Rapid needs assessment methods employ surveys in the field to collect information to determine the health status and basic needs of an affected community for resource allocation. Health surveillance is the systematic collection, analysis, and interpretation and dissemination of health data to characterize the burden of disaster-related morbidity and mortality in an affected community. Tracking systems refer to the collection and integration of data from environmental monitoring, exposures, and health effects in people over time. Information that is gathered during response and recovery phases help identify needs for ongoing care or public health intervention. Post-disaster epidemiologic investigations and studies employ descriptive and analytic techniques to better understand issues resulting from needs assessment or surveillance. Registries are for documenting environmental hazards and exposures to identify medium to long-term health consequences and needs for testing or care, and clarifies the link between exposures and health outcomes. Comprehensive disaster risk reduction strategies can play a role in increasing the resilience to different types of risks. The Sendai Framework is the global blueprint and 15-year plan to build the world's resilience to natural disasters. As part of its global targets, the Sendai Framework aims to substantially increase the number of countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategies by 2020, enhance international cooperation to developing countries by 2030, and increase availability of and access to multi-hazard early warning systems. It also aims to achieve substantial reduction in global disease mortality, number of people affected, direct economic losses, and damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services over the next 15 years. It was adopted at the third United Nations World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in Sendai, Japan in 2015. The Sendai Framework is the successor instrument to the Yogo Framework for Action, 2005 to 2015. It also includes 4 priorities of action, which are understanding disaster risk in all its dimensions of vulnerability, capacity, exposure of persons and assets, hazard characteristics, and the environment, strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk at the national, regional, and global levels, investing in disaster reduction for resilience through structural and non-structural measures, and enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response, and to build back better in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. The Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2010, or DRRM Act, or RA 10121, adopts and adheres to the strategies consistent with the international standards set by the Yogo Framework for Action. Its approach to disaster risk management is described as comprehensive, all-hazard, multi-sectoral, interagency, and community-based through the formulation of the National Disaster Risk Management Framework. Under the old law, or the PD 1566, the government was focused on disaster response such as provision of relief goods and infrastructures like dikes and flood control systems. The new law, or the RA 10121, or the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2010, transforms the Philippines disaster management system from disaster relief and response towards disaster risk reduction. It now shifts its focus to disaster risk reduction, putting emphasis on strengthening people's capacity to absorb stress, maintain basic functions during a disaster, and recover better from disasters. The DRRM Act broadened the membership of DRRM councils at all levels, from national to regional, provincial, city, municipal, and barangay councils. It also recognizes the importance of local communities by institutionalizing the participation of civil society organizations and the private sector. The National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council is a multi-sectoral body composed of the OST, DILG, DSWD, and NEDA that shall oversee the DRRM system in the Philippines. The National Disaster Risk Management Framework is the principal guide to disaster risk reduction and management efforts in the country and the basis for the formulation of the NDRRM plan. The plan covers the 4 thematic areas of disaster prevention and mitigation, disaster preparedness, disaster response, and disaster rehabilitation and recovery. Prevention and mitigation is the responsibility of the Department of Science and Technology. These refer to activities that reduce the effects of disaster, such as early warning systems, flood forecasting and monitoring, hazard and risk mapping, and both structural and non-structural interventions. Preparedness is the concern of the Department of Interior and Local Government. It involves activities prior to disaster, such as contingency planning, stockpiling, organizing responders, and emergency training, drills, and exercises. The area of response is the job of the Department of Social Welfare and Development. It is concerned with activities during a disaster, such as rapid needs assessment, issuance of advisories and situation reports, activation of response clusters and incident command systems. The recovery task of rehabilitation and reconstruction is the scope of the National Economic and Development Council. The recovery begins soon after the emergency phase has ended, involving measures applying the Build Back Better principle. To what level of prevention do these thematic areas correspond to? Previous studies have shown that exposure to disasters has detrimental impacts on people's mental health. It has been documented that survivors of Super Typhoon Haiyan experience psychological distress and post-traumatic stress. Post-traumatic stress disorder is the most common post-disaster diagnosis across research in disaster behavioral health, while major depression is the second most common post-disaster diagnosis. Evidence has shown that children are disproportionately affected in terms of mental health problems because of trauma and loss, abuse and neglect, and breakdown in support networks. As part of Sustainable Development Goals, it is imperative that we consider strengthening resilience and adaptation to natural disasters. These are my references, and thank you for listening.